Hello, my name is Hilary Keel, and I'm here today to hold a talk with the title Fairytales and Altered States. This is a talk that I held on April the 15th, 2020, a couple days ago, at the Tompkins Square Library, and I wanted to make this recording to document that talk I held. And in my talk, I first of all thanked Greg Masters for initiating this event, for initiating and coordinating and this event at the Tompkins Square Library, as well as Alyona Glushchenkova, who invited me to speak and also has guided me through some of this process with her. Right, my name, as I said, is Hilary Keel, and I teach German and the German fairy tale at Hunter College. I'm also a hypnotherapist and a poet, and I want to share with you some of my experiences and knowledge that I've gained in the area of fairy tales. So welcome to Fairytales and Altered States. How is a fairy tale like a dream? How is a dream like a trance? How do you know you are dreaming when you are dreaming? How do you know you are awake when you are awake? How do you know this is a fairy tale? How do you know this is not a fairy tale? How do you know you are not awake? Is this a fairy tale? Is this a dream? Am I awake? Is a fairy tale sometimes like real life? A fairy tale is sometimes like real life. Am I awake? Is a fairy tale this is a fairy tale? The listener sometimes thinks, the listener or reader thinks that it seems true or something like truth because some points and descriptions are so accurate and true to life or familiar, like we've been here before, like I know that person, I know that room, that tree, that duck, that plant, that bee. But then it isn't, or it is like a dream, when a dream seems real until we realize it has to be a dream, or we remember we are awake. What do fairy tales and the hypnotic trance have in common? They both speak to the unconscious. They both allow the unconscious to come forward. They both allow the unconscious to find solutions to obstacles and challenges. They both allow the unconscious to find solutions to impossible tasks. Impossible tasks become possible in the hypnotic trance and in the fairy tale. What is a hypnotic trance? What is a fairy tale? They both have existed for thousands of years. As far as the fairy tale goes, research tells us they have existed since at least the Bronze Age. Fairy tales are products of pre-literate societies. The hypnotic trance has also been around for thousands of years. For instance, we know the ancient Egyptians used trance in sleep temples for healing the ill. The trance is an everyday human state we find ourselves in when we are so focused that we forget everything happening around us. You know that feeling. There are many ways to fall into a trance, and we do this every day without even trying. It's when we fall into a daydream or down a rabbit hole. It's when we are so focused on a conversation, on a person, on a song, on a book, on a film, on a project, on something we're thinking, that we forget what is happening. This can also be induced through yoga, through breathing exercises, through meditation. It can also be induced through drugs. But the hypnotherapist induces trance to allow the client to allow the client's subconscious to come forward. It's that subconscious that finds the solutions to impossible tasks. The fairy tale does something similar. It begins with the words, "Once upon a time," which tell the listener or reader they are safe. and can now prepare for a journey where impossible challenges and barbaric forces are faced and overcome. Fairy tales are often associated with childhood and with children, but fairy tales were originally told by adults and for adults. They were told to inspire adults to overcome incredible obstacles. Fairy tales cultivate hope, even if it lasts for only 15 minutes. It wasn't until the 19th century that it became acceptable to share fairy tales with children. We share fairy tales to plant seeds of hope. As the folklorist Joanna Cole tells us, the fairy tale usually has a protagonist who is frequently a simpleton, and this simpleton is often, but not always, the third son, or a stepdaughter who is often number 3 in the family, but not always. At any rate, the protagonist is humble or humbled and in trouble. They are often banished, prohibited, and faced with the impossible. Other characters are the noodlehead who makes us laugh. They make us also laugh at ourselves. The clever trickster, who is the little guy pitted against a bully and who must break rules to get ahead. Or the greedy trickster, who is often a greedy fool and usually, but not always, a king. One of the most misunderstood and criticized characters in the fairy tale is the magical helper. The common understanding or misunderstanding of a magical helper is someone who appears out of nowhere as a protagonist passively waits for help. But as the folklorist Joanna Cole points out, this is not the case. The protagonist accesses magic and its helper by not shying away from the challenge. The protagonist is open, kind, and has a sense of trust. This is when the magical helper appears. The protagonist who is able to access magic does not know how to solve the problem, but is open to and grateful for any strokes of good fortune that come their way. This oftentimes comes in the form of a magical helper. So Joanna Cole tells us also about the significance of the Brothers Grimm in the development of fairy tales in Europe. As she tells us, the fairy tales were collected and rendered with the intention of preserving the oral tradition of storytelling by the Brothers Grimm, who set such precedents in the German-speaking world that other cultures wanted to follow suit. So who were the Brothers Grimm, and how does their biography inform our understanding of fairy tales and their fairy tales in particular? So once there were 2 brothers named Grimm. The first one's name was Jakob, or Jacob. The second one's name was Wilhelm. Jakob and Wilhelm were born in 1785 and 1786 in Hesse, in Germany. They were the 2 eldest sons of Philipp Wilhelm Grimm and their mother, Dorothee Zimmer. Philipp was an ambitious, diligent, and prosperous lawyer, and their mother was a devoted, caring, and sometimes melancholy mother. I assume she was melancholy because between 1785 and 1793, she gave birth to 9 children. That's 9 children in 8 years, and 6 of those children survived. The surviving children were 5 boys and 1 girl. Jakob and Wilhelm grew up in the town of Steinau near Kassel in Germany, where their father became the district judge and a leading town figure. They lived in a large home. They had servants. They had a good education. The 2 boys were the 2 eldest. Were inseparable. They were bright, hardworking, and loved country life, had an interest in farming and peasant life, nature, customs, and superstitions. And they were greatly impressed by their father's personal motto, which was, "Honesty is the best policy in life." So Unfortunately, when Jakob was 11 and Wilhelm was 10, their father, Philip Grimm, at the age of 44, died unexpectedly in 1796. This meant that their family lost their home, lost their income, lost their status, lost their servants, they lost everything. And luckily, Dorothea's sister, whose name was Henriette Zimmer, was a lady in waiting for a local princess and had friends in high places. And she arranged through her friends in high places to get these two very bright boys into a school, into a very good school. But although they were so incredibly bright, they were treated as socially inferior for the rest of their lives. So Jack Zipes, one of my favorite scholars on the Brothers Grimm, he tells us, quote, "For major portions of their entire lives, they suffered from social slights, financial deprivation, from their school days throughout their professional lives. But in their lifetimes, they became famous for their remarkable scholarship and great moral integrity." So they were, although they were treated badly, they worked 12 hours a day, so the story goes, to become the best students in school, which they were. They were always the best in the class, and they finished number one in their classes and wanted to study at the University of Marburg. They wanted to follow in their father's footsteps and study law. But the system was against them studying, although they were the most brilliant scholars, the most brilliant students. So they had to fight their way to get into school and had to pay their way through school, although the upper class students were given stipends. They were sort of punished for being inferior and had to pay their way through school. However, their remarkable scholarship did not go unrewarded, and they caught the attention of the founder of the university's law school, whose name was Carl von Savigny. And he was so impressed by these two students, who were brothers, that he became their mentor. And he taught them at the law school, quote, that the spirit of the law can be comprehended only by tracing its origins to the development of the customs and language of the people, and by paying attention to the changing historical context in which laws developed. So this is what inspired the Brothers Grimm to dedicate their entire lives to ancient German literature and folklore. So their lives were marked by political unrest and war, invasions, and as well as being treated as inferior. However, they by 1806 to 1810, they began to systematically collect fairy tales and folk tales. And they were in their early 20s. And by 1812, still in their 20s, they published the first volume of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, which is the children and household tales, known today as the Grimm's Fairy Tales. So the first edition was in 1812, and there were 7 editions of this book. And what is widely read today is the last version from 1857. So they worked on this book for 45 years, editing it and rewriting it. As I said, their lives were also marked by political unrest. They lived in Germany. Germany was not a nation, and they lived next to France, which was a grand nation. And the French were invading, and Germany was a series of principalities, and the Brothers Grimm were fighting against these principalities. They wanted democracy they wanted a country with a democracy instead of oppressive princes. So they fought against the oppression by the princes in Germany, and for a democracy and for the unification of their nation, which they never actually saw in their lifetimes. Their hopes for the unification and the democratic reform dwindled. But they were elected to civil parliaments. They were politically active. And Jakob himself was one of the most prominent men among the representatives at the National Assembly held in Frankfurt am Main. So they followed also in their father's footsteps in political career as well. However, although the political ideals never came to fruition in their lifetimes, they played an active role in the institutionalization of German literature as a field of study at universities. So they worked all their lives as librarians and German professors, and saw to it that German became a subject to be studied, just like French was next door in France. So they wrote German grammar books and a dictionary, which they did not in their lifetimes complete. They only got up to the letter F, and this dictionary was completed for them after their deaths. There are 12 published volumes of their essays and letters. Jakob wrote The History of the German Language. They both made scholarly contributions in the areas of folklore, history, ethnology, religion, jurisprudence, lexicography, and literary criticism. Jakob published 21 books, and Wilhelm published 14, and together they published 8 books. Both of them regarded their work as, quote, an effort to foster a sense of justice among the German people and to create pride in the folk tradition by passing down the wisdom of the ages. They wanted to, quote, uncover the etymological and linguistic truths that bound the German people together. They were in a divided country, and they wanted their people to be bound together by their truths. Their intention was to document basic truths about the customs and practice of the German people. So that's just a little bit about the Brothers Grimm. What interests me as a hypnotherapist is the translator of this book, Jack Sipes, is a great scholar, fairy tale scholar, and very knowledgeable about the Brothers Grimm. And he is not only a translator, but a scholar. And he has a beautiful definition in his book, Spells of Enchantment, which strikes me as a hypnotherapist. So he tells us that the fairy tales are tales that open our minds. We know that fairy tales lead to transformation. That's what defines a fairy tale. There has to be transformation, and to new states and new ways of thinking. What distinguishes the fairy tale from other short forms of fiction or other forms of fiction is that it is awe-inducing. They're awe-inspiring. They induce wonder. And wonder and awe are physical states. They are chemical states in our bodies. So these fairy tales, one can argue, have an effect on your whole bodily and mental state. And I want to share a fairy tale with you. In choosing a fairy tale, it's very hard because there are 210 tales, and then there are some 60 or 70 more omitted tales. So this book has the omitted tales as well. And so this, although it's called the Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm, there are not only fairy tales, but there are legends, myths, cumulative tales, jokes, anecdotes, riddles, religious tales, many types of tales in the book, and among them are the fairy tales. It's mostly made up of fairy tales. But each of these tales in this book, these bizarre little tales, each one is bizarre, naive, bizarre, absurd, illogical. They represent values from a time and culture very different from ours, which many of these values in these tales we might find objectionable to today. Yet as a book, if you read one tale, you say, "Wow, that's a funny little, bizarre little story." And is that really true? Is that really a truth? But they all together, all 210. If you read a large number of these tales, you realize that although they seem simple and naive, they create a very complex work. The whole body of this work is complex and sophisticated, and they can tell us something about our world today, as well as the world that they are from. So I've chosen one tale, and it is a tale that I'm guessing that most Americans, or general American public, is not so familiar with this tale, and that's why I chose this one. Once upon a time, a king and a queen lived together peacefully and had 12 children, all boys. One day the king said to his wife, "When you give birth to our 13th child, and it's a girl, the 12 boys shall die, so she may have all the wealth and kingdom for herself." He even had 12 coffins made, filled with wood shavings. Each was fitted with a death pillow, and all the coffins were locked in a room. The king gave the key to the queen and ordered her never to say one word about this to anyone. She then sat and lamented the entire day. Her youngest son, Benjamin, whose name she had taken from the Bible, was always with her, and he asked, "Dear mother, why are you so sad?" "Dearest child," she replied, "I'm not allowed to tell you." But he gave her no peace until she opened the room and showed him the 12 coffins already filled with wood shavings. She then said, "My dearest Benjamin, your father had these coffins made for you and your 11 brothers. If I give birth to a girl, all of you shall be killed and buried in them." As she was telling him this, she wept, and her son consoled her by saying, "Don't weep, dear mother. We'll find a way to help ourselves and get away from here." Then she said, "Go into the forest with your 11 brothers. I want you to find the tallest tree and take turns sitting on top. You are to keep watch and look toward the castle tower. If I give birth to little boys, I'll raise a white flag, and then you'll be able to return. If I give birth to a little girl, I'll raise a red flag, and then you're to flee as fast as you can, and may the good Lord protect you. I'll get up every night and pray that you are able to warm yourselves by a fire in the winter, and that you don't suffer from the heat during the summer." After she gave her blessing to her sons, they went out into the forest, where they took turns keeping watch. Each one sat on top of the tallest oak tree and looked toward the tower. When 11 days had passed and it was Benjamin's turn, he saw a flag being raised. However, it was not a white one, but a blood-red flag announcing that they were to die. When the brothers heard that, they became angry and said, "Why should we suffer death because of a girl? We swear we'll get our revenge. Wherever we find a girl, her red blood shall flow." Then they went deeper into the forest where it was darkest. There they found an empty little cottage which was bewitched. "We shall dwell here," they said, "and you, Benjamin, since you're the youngest and the weakest, shall stay home and keep house. We others shall go out and search for food." So they went off into the forest and shot hares, wild deer, birds, little pigeons, and whatever was fit to eat. They brought this to Benjamin, who had to prepare it nicely for them so they could still their hunger. They lived together for 10 years in this little cottage, and the time passed quickly for them. Meanwhile, the daughter that their mother, the queen, had brought into the world had grown to be a little girl. She had a kind heart and beautiful features, and a gold star on her forehead. One time, when there was a great deal of washing to do, she saw 12 boys' shirts among the things to be washed and asked her mother, "Whose shirts are these? They're much too small for father." Her mother answered with a heavy heart, "Dear child, they belong to your 12 brothers." "Where are my 12 brothers?" the girl asked. "I've never heard of them until now." "Only God knows where they are," she answered. "They're wandering around somewhere in the world." She took the girl, opened the room, and showed her the 12 coffins with the wood shavings and the death pillow. "These coffins were destined for your brothers," she said, "but the boys departed secretly before you were born." And then she told her everything that had happened. "Dear mother," the girl said, "don't weep. I'm going to look for my brothers." So she took the 12 shirts and went straight into the great forest. She walked the whole day, and by evening she came to the bewitched cottage. When she entered, she found a young boy who asked, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" He was astonished by her beauty, by her royal garments and the star on her forehead. "I'm a princess," she responded, "and I'm looking for my 12 brothers. I'm prepared to continue walking as far as the sky is blue until I find them." She showed him the 12 shirts, and Benjamin realized she was his sister. "I'm Benjamin," he said, "your youngest brother." She began to cry for joy, and they kissed and lovingly hugged each other. But then he said, "Dear sister, there's still a problem. We agreed that any maiden who came our way would have to die, for we had to leave our kingdom on account of a girl." "I'll gladly die," she said, "if I can save my 12 brothers by doing this." "No," he responded, "you shall not die. Sit down under this tub and wait till our 11 brothers come back. Then I'll settle everything with them." She did as he said, and when it was night, the others came back from the hunt and found their meal ready. After they sat down at the table and began eating, they asked, "What's new?" "You don't know," Benjamin said. "No," they replied. "You're in the forest the whole day," he continued, "while I stay at home, yet I still know more than you." "Then tell us," they cried out. "Only if you promise me that the first girl we meet shall not be killed," he said. "Yes," they exclaimed, "now tell us." "Our sister is here," he said. And he lifted up the tub, and the princess came crawling out in her royal garments. She had the gold star on her forehead and was very beautiful, gentle, and delicate. In their joy, they embraced and kissed her, for they loved her with all their hearts. Now, she stayed at home with Benjamin and helped him with the work. The 11 brothers went into the forest, caught wild game, deer, birds, and pigeons, so they would have something to eat, and their sister and Benjamin made sure the meals were prepared. They fetched the wood for cooking, herbs to go along with the vegetables, and put the pots in the fire, so dinner was always ready when the 11 brothers came home. Moreover, they kept the little cottage in order and put nice, clean, white sheets on the beds. All this kept the brothers satisfied, and they lived with her in great harmony. One day, the two at home had prepared a wonderful meal, and when they were all together, they sat down, ate, drank, and were full of joy. Now, there was a small garden next to the bewitched cottage, and in it were 12 lilies, also called students. Since she wanted to please her brothers, the sister plucked the 12 flowers with the intention of giving one to each brother at the end of the meal. But right after she had plucked the flowers, the 12 brothers were instantly changed into 12 ravens and flew away over the forest, while the cottage and the garden vanished as well. Now the maiden was all alone in the wild forest, and when she looked around, An old woman was standing near her, and she said, "My child, what have you done? Why didn't you leave those 12 white flowers alone? They were your brothers, and you've changed them into ravens forever." "Is there no way to save them?" the maiden asked as she wept. "No," the old woman said. There's only one way in the entire world. But it's so hard, you won't be able to set them free. You see, you would have to remain silent for 7 years and neither speak nor laugh. If you utter but a single word, and there is just an hour to go in the 7 years, everything will be in vain, and your brothers will be killed in that one word. "I know for sure," the maiden spoke with her whole heart, "that I shall save my brothers." She went and searched for a tall tree. After climbing it, she sat down and began spinning and did not say a word or laugh. Now it so happened that a king was hunting in the forest. He had a big greyhound that ran up the tree where the maiden was sitting. The dog began jumping around, yelping and barking at her. The king then went over to the tree and saw the beautiful princess with a gold star on her forehead. He was so enraptured by her beauty that he called up to her and asked her if she would be his wife. She did not respond, but nodded a little with her head. Then he climbed up the tree himself, carried her down, put her on his horse, and took her home. The wedding was celebrated with great splendor and joy, but the bride did not speak or laugh. After they lived together for a few years, the king's mother, who was an evil woman, began to slander the young queen and said to the king, "The maiden you brought home with you is nothing but a common beggar girl. Who knows what godless mischief she's been secretly plotting? If she's mute and can't talk, she could at least laugh every now and then. Anyone who doesn't laugh must have a bad conscience." At first, the king did not want to believe this, but the old woman kept at it so long and accused the maiden of so many wicked things that the king finally let himself be convinced and sentenced her to death. The huge fire was made in the courtyard, and the young queen was to be burned in it. The king stood upstairs at a window and watched everything with tears in his eyes, since he still loved her. When she was already bound to the stake and the fire was licking at her clothes with its red tongues, the last second of the 7 years expired. Suddenly, a whirring sound could be heard in the air, and 12 ravens came flying toward the yard and swooped down. Then, just as they touched the ground, they turned into 12 brothers whom she had saved. They tore apart the fire, put out the flames, freed their dear sister, and hugged and kissed her. Now that she was allowed to open her mouth and speak, she told the king why she had been silent and had never laughed. The king was glad to hear she was innocent, and they all lived together in harmony until their death. The evil mother was brought before the court and put into a barrel that was filled with boiling oil and poisonous snakes. Indeed, she died a horrible death. So that was the tale, tale number 9 in the book, tale number 9. It's called The 12 Brothers. So my question to you after hearing that tale is, what do you take away from it? What sticks in your mind? What disturbs you? What intrigues you? What outrages you? What frustrates you? What satisfies you? What makes you feel good? Notice how you react to the tale. Your reaction tells you something about yourself, something about your needs and desires. Some tales, more than others, speak particularly to you and your issue of the year, the month, the day, or the moment. I notice this when teaching and students get excited, positively or negatively, about a particular tale. It's always a surprise to experience a variety of reactions, and oftentimes the reactions are large and passionate. The tales speak to our wanting things to be different. Sometimes a particular detail in a narrative speaks to something in your own life. Sometimes a detail triggers us and we remember it for a long time. They get us thinking, what needs to happen here? This is the question the hypnotist or hypnotherapist asks the client in the trance. The hypnotized one goes off on a journey to visit or create the narratives that need treating or changing in their lives. Each person comes up with their own unique solution to how that tale needs to be resolved. The psychologist Bruno Bettelheim tells us there is no one particular interpretation to any tale. These tales, he tells us, speak to our unconscious, the child's or the adult's unconscious, and we interpret them according to our needs in the moment of the moment. The tales plant seeds of hope, and hope is always healthy for humans. Hope is what enables humans to survive in a disaster. This is why we can read a tale at the age of 5 and the same tale at the age of 50, and we get some completely different message out of it, some completely new truth or insight, depending on our age and the moment that we read it or experience it. The Germanicist Maria Tatar, who chairs Harvard's program in folklore and mythology, tells us the old or so-called original versions by the Brothers Grimm or by Perrault are springboards to new way of thinking. We call them so-called because, of course, the Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault did not invent these tales. They were thousands of years old. They came from the Bronze Age or who knows when. But the old versions from earlier centuries give us a foundation. They give us primordial images of the collective unconscious. They are cultural artifacts. But even though they are facts that were put in writing, they are always in flux. Since these are originally passed by word of mouth, it is in their nature to constantly change. If a narrative bothers you, irritates you, frightens you, the hypnotist would ask, where is the feeling? Where is it in your body? And this is what I ask the reader as well. It is important information for the reader to understand what their personal issues are by way of the tales. What desires, fears, and wishes does the tale fulfill or contain? What does the tale address at the moment? Because needs, wishes, desires, and fears, like the tales, constantly change. Whether you are a reader or an author, I encourage you to read fairy tales, explore fairy tales, share fairy tales with the children in your lives, and rewrite them. In these explorations, look into yourself and notice what happens. On one hand, you can read and share them to examine history and culture. A frequent question asked in the Grimm's fairy tales is, where are you going? Where have you been? How do the tales answer that question? How do you answer that question about yourself? Examine the tales as artifacts left behind from a world that no longer exists. What does that have to do with our world today? As one student said to me recently in class this semester, quote, reading this fairy tale is like jumping into a time machine. Read them to be transported. And in this transport, or altered state, look inside yourself. What does it teach you about yourself? How can you change the tale to meet your needs? How can it be rewritten? Does it need rewriting? How can you improve your own tale? How can you improve the narrative of your life? What does this newly rewritten version tell you about yourself? The fairy tale often ends with a sentence such as, happiness was bestowed on them for the rest of their lives. I'll end this talk with, how can you become the king or queen of your destiny? How can you alter your state? What needs to happen? Thank you.